So, hello everyone. I'm Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the February Literary Modiin author event. Today, on day 499, we've had in the last several weeks, we're so happy to see 19 of our beloved hostages reunited with their families. And I know you all join with me in the fervent hope that we will soon see all 73 of our hostages home. And at the end of the session, I'll say a bit more about that. But for now, I want to turn to our main event, and that is something joyful, which is the release of new Jewish books into the world. For those of you who are new to Literary Modiin, we started about 5.5 years ago as an in-person event, and then with the pandemic, we switched to a Zoom event, and now we're back to hybrid events occasionally. This is our 58th event. So the format is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And we have a large attendance today, so everyone is on mute, but you can put any questions as we're going through in the chat box, and any technical difficulties, just send them as a private note in the chat to me. So I will now introduce our first author. Born in Israel and raised in New York City, Zeeva Bukai is a writer with degrees in acting, theater, and fiction. As a writer, her honors include a fellowship at the New York Center for Fiction and residencies at Hedgebrook and Birdcliff Artist in Residence Program. Her short fiction has been widely published, including in the Master's Review, where she was the recipient of the Fall Fiction Prize, and December Magazine, where her story, The Abandoning, was selected by Lily King for the Kurt Johnson Prose Prize. The Abandoning was an early version of the first chapter of The Anatomy of Exile, which is her debut novel, and that's what she'll be talking to us about today. So, Zeeva, let me spotlight you. You can take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Julie, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and to be talking about The Anatomy of Exile. So people ask where stories come from, and I realize that so many of my stories actually come from family history, things that I heard from my grandparents, from my own parents, and consciously or unconsciously, the threads of those stories come into my own fiction. And The Anatomy of Exile is actually about an Israeli family that immigrates to the US in 1967 after the Six-Day War and after the death of a beloved sister-in-law a beloved sister actually, who is killed in what appears to be a terror attack, but is actually a love affair with a Palestinian man and an Israeli woman that ends tragically. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. But there's a lot more to it. And the kinds of themes that I wanted to talk about were things like war and exile and immigration and what happens to a marriage after a family immigrates to another country. What are those stresses? What are what are some of the things that they go through? And I wanted to also explore my own immigrant experience, an intercultural marriage between a Mizrahi man and an Ashkenazi woman, which is a kind of where my parents were at too. My mother was born in Siberia, actually, at the start of the Second World War, and my father was born in Damascus, Syria. And what I was very interested in this book is to actually explore the whole Mizrahi side of that family and what happened. So there were a few things that made their way into this story. The first is what we call Aliyat HaElif, which was Operation 1,000 Children that took place between 1945 and 1946, where a group of Syrian youth or a group of Syrian men and women who had come to Israel by crossing the Golan Heights earlier around the 1920s and 30s, created a program that would bring in at least 1,000 Syrian children. They wound up bringing in 1,300. My father was 13 years old, and he crossed the Golan Heights in this within this the framework of this program, along with his two younger brothers. One was 8 and one was 11. And once they crossed in, my two uncles were placed on Tel Yosef, where a lot of Syrian children were placed. And as I said, they were smuggled in. This happened, they were smuggled in at night, crossing the Golan Heights under the cover of darkness. They were secretly placed in Tel Yosef. And my father was actually placed in Moshav Balforia, not too far from Tel Yosef. And so every Friday he would hitch a ride, or he would, if he was lucky enough, get a bus to go and see his younger brothers and spend Shabbat with them. My father lived with a Czech couple who were childless and spoke only Czech and Yiddish. And my father, being an Arab speaker, was learning Hebrew very quickly because he did have a base of Hebrew knowledge. But my father actually learned Yiddish and spoke Yiddish fluently. So I think both he and my uncles knew which side their bread was buttered on, because all three of them married Ashkenazi women. And considering the kind of social class of Israel at that time, certainly the Ashkenazis were part of the ruling class. So that was one aspect that made its way into the novel. In the story, it is Salim and his sister Hadass who cross the Golan Heights into Israel and are placed on a kibbutz. And then a year later, their parents come. For my father, he did not see his parents for over 40 years until they were finally allowed out of Syria. And my grandmother actually traveled to the United States. The next thing that the next aspect of my family history that made its way into the novel was the story of Sheikh Munis. And Sheikh Munis in my novel is actually, Sheikh Munis was an Arab village that began in Palestine, what was then Palestine. Probably, I mean, the first, I think, recording of that village was in the late 1700s, early 1800s, where there was a small Arab community there. Later on, it grew, and I think there were close to 3,000 residents in Sheikh Munis. And Sheikh Munis today is actually Tel Aviv University and Ramat Aviv. And the story of Sheikh Munis makes its way into my novel in the form of Kfar Ma'an. I created a new name and I had to reimagine this place. When I went to Israel in 1976 to go to Tel Aviv University, I was in a Mechina program and then in the theater program. My father actually sat down and told me, he said, "Oh, I know where that is. That's Sheikh Munis." And he told me the story of his family and Sheikh Munis. So in March of 1948, the village was abandoned. The residents there, the Arab residents, were frightened that they were going to be killed. The Irgun, a few weeks earlier, had set siege to the village because they were afraid that guerrillas were infiltrating, Arab guerrillas were infiltrating and fighting from there. And then, after the siege was over, the Arab population en masse left. And many of them went to Qalqilia and other parts of what was then, the West Bank. And in the story, this village kind of haunts the novel. For my father, in 1949, his family, his sister, her husband, and my cousin, along with my father and 200 other, mostly Mizrahi families, were placed on this abandoned village on Sheikh Munis and lived there for quite a few years. And the reason that they were placed there was because there was an influx of immigration into Israel at that time, already in 1949 and certainly in the early 50s. And the government, this early government, the nascent government, had to place people somewhere. And so these families were placed there. Today at Tel Aviv University, there is a place called the Greenhouse. And it was a sheikh's house, quite beautiful. It's been renovated, and Tel Aviv University uses it as a place for faculty celebrations and all sorts of other events. The greenhouse actually is where my aunt's family and two other families actually lived when they lived on Sheikh Munis. And this was my connection. And that whole story kind of haunted me. And when I was living at Tel Aviv University, I lived on Rehov Rekanati, which was down the street from Tel Aviv University. And my roommates and I would cross the street, walk a block, and there was a pardes, there was an orchard, and we would literally pick pomelot, right, pomela, and lemons. It was a citrus orchard, and there was a beautiful house there as well that was completely abandoned. And so this idea of this village actually, you know, haunted my novel because it haunted me. So these were two of the things, two small things that come into the novel, as well as other family history. And I'm going to take a moment to read a little bit of the beginning of the novel. Um, if we're okay on time, Julie. Are we okay on time? Great. Okay. So, Tel Aviv, 1967. They were on the beach when they heard the news of Hadassah's death. It came over the transistor radio, her name cut through the surf and salted air that swelled with the gleeful cries of children and ice cream vendors hawking their wares. Salim sank to his knees as the lifeguards whistled cautioned swimmers to stay close to shore. Tamar drew circles of comfort on her husband's shoulders and whispered that it couldn't be his sister who'd been killed on the bus from Haifa to Tel Aviv. In a daze, they gathered their things, her feet burning as she stumbled after him. They ran past the water spigot and outdoor showers, stopped to slip on their sandals, and lost their towels along the way. They crossed against the light on Ben Yehuda Street. Cars stopped, drivers cursed and shook their fists at them. They charged through the afternoon heat, their breath loud in their ears. Salim was the first to reach their apartment on Frug Street. Tamar was close behind. He tried inserting the key into the lock, but it fell from his hands. She bent to retrieve it and fought the urge to glide her hands up over his body, if only to remind him that they were alive. She opened the door, and he staggered ahead. The rooms were dim, light beating through the closed jalousies. They didn't speak. They didn't strip out of their damp bathing suits or comb their matted hair. He thrust his legs into a pair of trousers and set off for the police station. She watched him from the balcony, his figure receding, and wanted to call him back, afraid he'd disappear like Hadass. When he was gone, she sought the strip of horizon between the Bauhaus buildings, the fresh scar that separated blue sky from bluer seas, then cupped her hands over her ears and imagined waves tumbling onto the shore. She felt the weight of water, the motion of current, its rhythm a steady pulse. She saw Salim as he was that afternoon, powerful, sturdy, as she wrapped her legs around his hips, his feet buried in silt, their kisses a gentle bumping of teeth and salty tongues, their swim graceful as two seals, their laughter palpating the sky. She tried to recapture the moment before he adjusted the radio dial, and then the beep signaling the hourly news, curdling the day like a spoon of vinegar in a cup of milk. Okay. Um,
That's so nice.
Thank you. Okay, so I Do I have I'm done, right? Is that
No, you have another minute or two if you want.
okay? So I just want to say for the writers out there, this book took me 10 years to write. It was not an easy feat. And I think, like, in terms of practice and craft and everything else, that getting a novel together, um, the entire emotional weight of it and everything else takes a lot of persistence. It's really a matter of coming back to it all the time, every day until it's done. Thank you so much for being here and for listening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank
Yeah, I think like writers, perseverance has to be our middle name. Some of you probably heard me say that before, but persistence and perseverance,
Yeah.
100%.
you.
Thank you for that beautiful reading and talk. Okay, now we're gonna switch gears completely. And we'll introduce our next author. Ruth Franklin's The Many Lives of Anne Frank was published in January by the Yale Jewish Lives series. Her book, Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, won numerous awards, including the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography, and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016, a Time Magazine Top Nonfiction Book of 2016, and a Best Book of 2016 by the Boston Globe, NPR, and others. She's also the author of A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, which was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Writing. Her criticism and essays appear in many publications, including The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, New York Review of Books, and Harper's. She teaches nonfiction writing in an MFA program at Columbia University School of the Arts and writes a newsletter about biography and criticism. And Ruth, you didn't put the most important thing in your bio for me, which is that Ruth was an editor-in-chief of the Columbia Spectator 4 years after I was.
Well,
but we only met like last year in Israel the first time.
well, thank you, Julie, for filling in that important missing piece of my bio. And thanks, of course, so much for having me here. It's so nice to be among you, reading with these wonderful writers, to see so many familiar names in the participants. Really happy to be among this group. And thank you, Zeeva, for such a beautiful reading and presentation. And you're a hard act to follow, but I'm really looking forward to reading your book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what drew me to this book and to the subject of Anne Frank. And then, like Zeeva, I will read just a few pages to give you a taste for the experience of reading that book. So, and on the subject of persistence, Zeeva's book took 10 years. My Shirley Jackson book took 6 years. And this book, which just came out almost 3 weeks ago, also took around 6 years. So, all books are their own process. You have to learn how to write each one from the very beginning. And there's, things operate in their own way. In the time that I spent researching and writing this book, I heard the question from many people, sometimes phrased nicely, sometimes phrased less nicely. Why does the world need another book about Anne Frank, about whom so much has already been said and written? And what drew me personally to this subject, of course, like so many of us growing up as a Jewish American in the 80s, of course, I read her diary as a child. I even visited the Anne Frank house as a child on a family vacation. And like so many of us, I felt that I knew Anne's story and that there wasn't really much more to be said about it. And then in the 90s and the early 2000s, I started to notice the diary was regularly resurfacing in the news. There was a story about some missing pages that had somehow been rediscovered, or other elements of the editing of the diary. It came out for the first time that Anne herself had edited her diary with an eye to publication. And as a writer, I found that part of her story really fascinating and wondered why nobody had made more of that in the past. At the same time, you also often heard about her father's work on her diary, her father's supposed censorship of her words, of her criticism about her mother, for instance, of her thoughts about her developing body and her life as a woman. And when he was brought up, it often was in these very vilifying terms, which over the course of my research, I found was in fact a gross misrepresentation. And meanwhile, Anne Frank maintains this position consistently as a figure of fascination in our culture. The word most often used about her, it seems, is icon. Her face is on billboards, including this one that I chose to use as a cover image for my book. This actually is of a billboard in New Haven, done by a graffiti artist who was inspired by Anne Frank's story. Statues of her in gardens around the world. She's continually invoked in a political context. During the Syrian refugee crisis of the mid 20 teens, for instance, one New York Times columnist wrote a column that was titled "Anne Frank Today is a Syrian Girl" in the context of the migrants who were being denied visas, denied the right to resettle in safer countries, just as the Franks were in 1940 and 1941 as they desperately tried to escape Europe. And of course, she's invoked in countless other political contexts, everything from climate change even to anti-Zionism. And if you're curious about this, of course, there's more in my book. And also on my Substack newsletter, in which I've examined some of these elements. The goal of my book really was to put those two pieces together, the Anne Frank as a writer, as a human being, as a real girl, a teenager who was growing up in the Netherlands, whose individuality seemed to be kind of erased. The more that she becomes an icon, the more we kind of lose sight of her as a human being, as a real person. And so I wanted to get back to a sense of who she really was, what kind of person she was. And at the same time, understand what had made her so much of an icon. What exactly was it about this book that has inspired so many people around the world? It's the most popular work of literature to arise from the Holocaust. More than 30 million copies in print in more than 70 languages. But I feel like those statistics don't even really adequately explain just how popular the Diary of Anne Frank is. And in the course of my research, I found myself collecting all kinds of stories about people who had been inspired by her in many, many different ways all over the world, from, an Eritrean refugee who came upon her book in an Ethiopian refugee camp, to Japanese people in the wake of Hiroshima who read the diary and identified with it, to South African anti-apartheid activists who actually read her diary in prison. And copied out her words as inspiration. And so I wanted to try to put those two pieces together, the girl and the icon, and explain Anne Frank as both a person and as a symbol. And that's how my book is actually structured. The first part is titled Anne Frank, and it's a biography of her with a lot of context about not only about her life and the situation for Jews in the Netherlands as the Nazis invaded and set restrictions and persecution, a depiction of what's going on outside the annex while she's in prison there, as well as putting together the story of what happened to her after the diary ends, when the annex is raided and she's deported first to Westerbork, the transit camp for Dutch Jews, then to Auschwitz, and finally to Bergen-Belsen, where she dies. And the second part is called Anne Frank in quotes. And that part is kind of a cultural history of the idea of Anne Frank as it's changed and developed in the years since the diary was first published. So we see the diary being edited by her father, being published in the Netherlands and then in America, where it immediately becomes a blockbuster. And we take it through its adaptation for Broadway and then for the movies, and then examine different aspects of Anne's afterlife, the many, many novels and other works of art that imagine what might have happened to her if she had survived, what kind of person she would be, what she would have created. And finally, a final chapter about her life in the political arena and the ways in which she's been harnessed and even co-opted, appropriated to all different kinds of political causes, many of which had nothing to do with the actual circumstances of her life. But I would say the thing that I emphasize more than anything else, the greatest misunderstanding that we have about Anne Frank is about the diary itself, and her intentions as a writer. And I'll just say briefly, there's much, much more to say about it. It occupies a lot of my book. But briefly, her diary, as we know it, as many of you may know, but there's this myth that persists. Her diary was not a found object or found art, as many people have called it, but a very carefully composed testimony to the Nazi persecution of Jews in the Netherlands. She was inspired by a Dutch minister's call for the creation of a national archive after the war that would include private documents. After hearing him on the radio, she was inspired to go back and rewrite her diary from the beginning to de-emphasize the personal elements and emphasize the testimonial elements. And so, as other critics have pointed out, it's really more of a memoir than a diary. And it's a book that she very much hoped and intended to publish. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A section, about how we know the first versions of the diary, how we found them, and how we know what her intentions are. But for now, I'll just say that I believe that recognizing and respecting what she was trying to do as a writer is a crucial first step in reclaiming her as a human being rather than a symbol. So as I started work on this book, the phrase came to my mind that I wanted to write alongside Anne rather than over her. I didn't even have a sense initially of what that meant. But of course, here we have this young woman, this diarist, who tells the story of her own life so eloquently, so completely, that I felt, that I wanted to add to her words rather than try to erase them in any way. And what that turned out to mean for me was going back to what's called version A, the rough draft of her diary, this original version that she then would edit. And examining that very, very closely as the most primary text that exists about her. And it's that version that I quote from in this book. And so the Anne that you find here her voice may sound a little bit unfamiliar, even to those of you who are very, very well acquainted with the diary. I incorporate her words alongside my own commentary on them. And I also use a lot of memoirs and testimony from people who knew her to fill out the picture of the world outside the annex, and especially her life after the diary ends in the camps. So I'm going to read just a few pages to give you a sense of the book's voice and how I approach Anne. And I'm starting with a section that describes the triggering event that caused the Franks to go into hiding in the first place. But we're in July 1942. The Nazis have now occupied the Netherlands for just over 2 years. The restrictions on Jews have been mounting, and so Otto Frank has already started to prepare a hiding place for them in what we now know as the annex, the back half of the office building that he had his business in. He thought that they would have more time, but they decided to go into hiding quite suddenly when this happens. July 5th, 1942, 3 p.m. The doorbell rings at Mervedeplein 37-2. Anne is expecting her new boyfriend, Hello Silverberg. They've already spent the morning together, sitting in the sun. The parks may be off limits, but Anne's apartment has a balcony. Like her, Hello was born in Germany. His real name is Helmut. But he's been living in Amsterdam with his grandparents since 1938, after his father's clothing store was destroyed during Kristallnacht. He's 16, and at first he preferred Margot, Anne's older sister, but she was completely unapproachable. When he met Anne at a friend's house, she made an impression on him, despite being 3 years younger. Quickly, he became fascinated with her. The two of them have been going out only for a week or so, but they've spent a lot of time together. He walks her to the Jewish Lyceum in the mornings. After school, they go to the Oasis ice cream parlor or hang out at each other's homes. They speak Dutch together, not German. He loves to hear her talk. She asks him about his family, how he came to the Netherlands, what happened to his parents. They fled to Belgium. He's had barely any contact with them for 4 years. His grandmother thinks Anne is too young for him, but he doesn't care. Like many Jewish teenagers in their circles, he also goes to meetings of the Zionist Club. His grandparents don't approve of that either, so he's used to asserting himself. Perhaps this is part of what Anne finds attractive in him. Or perhaps it's just that he's older and clearly interested in her. But it's not hello at the door. A man's voice calls, "Miss Margaret Frank." Edith goes down to answer. The man gives her an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. At the top, in large capital letters, it reads, "Summons. You are hereby ordered to participate in the police-supervised work relief program currently taking place in Germany and are therefore to appear on July 15th, 1942 at 1:50 a.m. at Amsterdam Central Station. The following may be taken as baggage: 1 valise or rucksack, 1 pair of work boots, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 pairs of underpants, 2 waistcoats, 1 pair of overalls, 2 sets of bedclothes, 1 bowl, 1 drinking cup, 1 spoon, and 1 cardigan, as well as provisions for a 3-day march and the ration coupons valid for that period. Should you fail to give heed to this summons, you will be punished with measures to be taken by the Sicherheitspolizei. Impossible to imagine what goes through Edith's mind at this moment. Otto is out visiting residents at a home for elderly and indigent Jews. Edith leaves the girls together in the apartment and returns with Mr. Van Pels. Anne is told that the summons is for Otto, not Margot. Considering how close Anne is to her father, it's not clear why Edith thinks she'll find this less frightening. The doors are locked. The Franks prepare to go into hiding immediately. Anne finds an excuse to drop off a few things with the neighbor's daughter. Toaster Coopers, a book, a tin of marbles, a tea set. She will not say goodbye to hello. So I will stop there and pass the virtual mic over to Lihi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you. Wow.
Chills.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our third author for the evening. Lihi Lapid is a best-selling author, journalist, and speaker on contemporary women's issues. She has written 3 best-selling novels on her own, Secrets from Within and Women of Valor, as well as a best-selling children's book. For over 10 years, she has been writing a weekly column in Israel's main newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, which have been gathered in the book, I Can't Always Be Wonderful. Prior to becoming a writer, she was a professional news photographer. She lives with her husband, Yair Lapid, politician and former prime minister of Israel, and their 2 children in Tel Aviv. Lihi is also the president of a nonprofit organization, Shekel, Inclusion for People with Disabilities. And it doesn't say this in your bio, but her book on her own was just a finalist in the National Jewish Book Awards in 2 categories, the book club and I think Hebrew literature and translation. So Mazal Tov, Lihi. And
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you with us. Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a big honor, and I was so surprised and happy because I really wanted my book to go out of Israel and do his steps outside of Israel. So first of all, thank you very much, Ruth. It gave me the chills to read about Anne Frank in times we are dealing with hostages and releasing hostages and things like that. It's like, wow. So it gives me the chills. And Zeeva, I'm a moment from Sheikh Mounès, so I just live a block away. So it's also, so everything is close to home. Hi, everybody. I was like Julie said, I was a news photographer. That's everything I was supposed to be. I studied art school. Um, I was supposed to be a painter. That's what I dreamt to be. And then I saw an art show of Francis Bacon, and I decided if we have Francis Bacon, they don't need me to paint. So I started photographing, and um, and I was a photographer in the army, which was a dream come true for me. I couldn't believe I'll be accepted, and I was, and it was very special. I was the second woman ever to be a news photographer in the army. And while I was in the army, there was a guy that did reserves. He was a writer, and I went to photograph his article, and we got married. So, and I want to say for Zeeva, um, it's very funny. Sorry for doing a detour, but I was my camp in the army was Sheikh Muniz, and I was guarding in the morning, like 6 o'clock in the morning, in that day that I was going with the ear to this article to do this report, and he forgot his keys in the car and locked the car. You remember, it's something that doesn't happen anymore because our cars are smarter than us, but it happened then, and he stayed with me in Sheikh Muniz until 6 o'clock in the morning, and that's the end of it. And we didn't stay apart since then for the last 34 years. So Sheikh Muniz is is our romantic meeting. So hi everybody. So I was a news photographer. I never thought of writing. I had a motorbike. I was super cool. I went with my cameras everywhere, and then I was pregnant. I think my last big assignment was I was going to Rwanda to photograph in the massacre, in the horrible massacre that happened there. I went to photograph for a newspaper in Israel, and I came back totally shocked from what I saw. I was with the Israeli army that came to give aid, and I came back to Israel, and one of the first thing I did was taking my motorbike and my helmet and my big camera with 20 kilos of cameras, and I went to my doctor for regular exam because I was pregnant. It was my third pregnancy. The first two didn't succeed. It's a statistics that no one talks about, and we need to talk more about it. And when I came to the doctor, he looked at me and he said, "You don't understand. It doesn't go together. Pregnancy and Rwanda and motorbike and a huge bag of cameras." And I was totally shocked because I grew up thinking there's no difference between men and women. I can do everything that they can do. What do you mean it doesn't work together? And then he said, you need to be in bed rest until the end of pregnancy. Give up your motorbike, give up your cameras if you want to be a mother. I stayed in bed for 6 months, growing up, a lot of chins and my belly and my son. And it was the first time that I realized that they are talking about the fact that we can do everything, but sometimes not at the same rhythm of men, that men can do it. And it's a little bit more difficult. When Lior was born, I found out that no newspaper wants a news photographer that breastfeed every 4 hours. In the motorbike, there's no place for a baby chair. And I started saying, wow, something I didn't understand something, or they didn't tell me something. And then I realized I'm unemployed. I said, I'm already at home, and after a year and 1 month, my daughter was born, and I was a mother of two. I remember in the TV there were those four women from Sex and the City. I hated them because they were having fun in Manhattan, going with high heels, going to pubs and bars and drinking with their friends. And I was like, with two babies, trying to figure out how you do it. How do you take a couple and two kids and two babies and make them a family? How does it happen? How do you take an apartment and make it your home? And I started thinking about it, reading about it, trying to look for the cleverness of women of other generations, because I thought that there was smart things going out between mothers and grandmothers and granddaughters, that this generation, that we know everything better, we don't need anyone. We put us apart from this huge knowledge of women. So I started reading about women, and I was angry because I felt I was lied to. And then one day, I remember it, I took the big black curtains that were blocking the light from my dark room, that I was developing pictures there. I torn them, I opened the windows, I took a computer, and I started writing. I started writing because I was upset and angry. But I want to say one thing, if I go a little bit back, because I married this guy that was a reporter in the newspaper, and he wrote articles and he wrote books, and his mother is a very, very famous writer. Her name is Lihi Lapid. She wrote a wonderful book called Valley of Strength, about a chalutza, a pioneer that comes to Israel at the beginning. So his mother is a writer, and his father was a writer and a newspaper man. And I was like, at a certain point, I decided that instead of staying in their dinners feeling stupid, feeling like they're talking about literature all the time and I don't know anything. So I decided, while being a photographer, to study 1 year in Tel Aviv University, literature and poetry, just in order not to be stupid at dinners. And at that moment that I torn down the curtains from my dark room and started writing, it came back, all the things that I learned about literature. And I started writing a book. And the book was about that, about the transformation between being this free woman, can do everything by herself, and being a mother. It led me to be a writer. It gave me a column, like you said, Julie, in the newspaper, that I wrote about family and life. And then I wrote a second book that was really milestone in the discussion about kids with disabilities, about being parents of kids with disabilities. It was very, very difficult for me to publish it. I wrote it. We have a daughter. She's now 27 years old, and she's autistic, and she doesn't speak. And she took us to an amazing, heartbreaking journey, changed our life totally. And I wrote that book, and after I finished writing the book, I didn't publish it for more than a year. I didn't publish it because I was so afraid of the reactions. And then I published it, and it was a huge success because it talked, I think, for the first time, people that talked about being a parent of kids with special needs. My latest book, On Her Own, comes from a total different thing. I thought, I don't want to write about myself. I think the word me doesn't appear in the book almost at any point. It's a story, but it's so, so personal. My brother lived in LA for more than 30 years. And I saw the difficulties of my parents having their grandchildren growing up in a different continent. My parents are Israelis, very simple people. I love them and they are amazing. They have a store and they don't know English perfect. And my brother's kids didn't study Hebrew. And the gap between them was so big. And then I started thinking, what would happen if my son decides to leave to another country? I'm obligated to be with Yael and take care of her till my last day. And I have one son that can take care of me. And what will happen if he will go? I wrote the story of On Her Own. I will tell you, because if I'll read my accent, you won't survive it. So I'm 5 o'clock in the morning. Nina, a young girl that escaped from her hometown down at the south of Israel, hides in a stairwell in Tel Aviv. 4 o'clock in the morning, an old woman is going down the stairs. Her name is Carmela. Nina, frightened from people that hunt her, tried to hide. When Carmela opens the light, looks at Nina and tells her, Dana, my Dana, finally you came back for me. She's not Dana, she's Nina. And she goes to live with Carmela. And that's where the story starts, with this woman that misses her son, that lives in America with his daughter, that she misses her so much. Julie says, yes, so I think I finished my time. And I will say one more thing, that the book was published this year on March 24 during the war. And one thing that was very, very strong for me, Carmela lost one of her sons. She had two sons. One she lost in a war 30 years ago, and she misses him like crazy. And her other son lives in America. And I think through that book, when you read it, you realize what it is to be a soldier in Israel. It's not to be a war machine. In Israel, a soldier is just one of our kids, arrived to the age of 18 and needed to go to the army. And I think that gentleness of what it is to be a family of a soldier that died goes very gently through the book. And I hope a lot of people outside of Israel will read it and understand something very, very deep about our lives here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm curious to hear. I'm going to add all of our spotlights. Thank you, Lihi. It's great to hear you speak about the book, and your whole background in getting there. So please, everyone, while I'm doing this, put your questions in the chat. Okay. And I need to ask you all to unmute. Yeah, I see like things in the chat of just everyone thanking the three of you for your amazing presentations, which I knew they would be amazing, all three of you. What was I gonna say? Oh, I know. My first question actually is for Lihi. Have you heard reactions from people who have read the book outside of Israel, who aren't so familiar with Israel, non-Jews? Like, what has been the reaction to that?
I'll tell you one thing, that it's really, really difficult for an Israeli writer to reach out an audience that is not Jewish.
Mhm.
Let's face it. And that's my goal. That's why I'm sitting at nights doing every podcast possible and everything, because I do feel that it needs all those three books, I think, can help really. We are talking all the time about the lack of explaining Israel in the world. I think all those three books that we're discussing today can help. But I will tell you that in HarperCollins, the publishing house, we had a meeting, and they loved the book. And we were in a room. One of them was Spanish, one of them was Filipino, one of them was, and it was a room, and each one talked about the thing that is in the heart of the book, is the fact that how it is to be an immigrant, because one of the characters, the mother of Nina, is a Russian immigrant that immigrates to Israel. Itamar is immigrating from Israel to America. And it's in a way, America and Israel are countries of immigration. They started with people that immigrates. And I think that the first generation of immigrants pay a huge price while their kids assimilate in their countries. And I remember one day hearing my brother kids fixing his accent in English.
Mhm.
And I thought about all of us hearing our grandparents or parents talking with a Yiddish accent, with a German accent, and we are, and a generation after generation. And I do think that now we are in a globalization world, and so many kids are going to work wherever it is. And the big question is, how do we keep a family close together, even with a huge sea separates us? How do we do it? Because more and more families are dealing with it. And I think a lot of people here that are with us in the Zoom either left parents in America and came here, or left kids here, went to America, and it's a discussion that I think need to be done on how we do it, how we keep a family strong together.
It's so hard. It's so hard. And I'll just say one quick funny story, and then something else about that. Is that my kids here, of course, all correct my Hebrew pronunciation. And once my daughter was saying to me, "Mommy, it's not Cinderella, it's Cinderella." Like, well, I think that's it's an English word or an English name. Anyway, but actually, what you were talking about, Lee, is exactly the topic of in Zeeva's book deals with this exactly, how to keep the family together. So it's very interesting. Um, there's a lot of questions. Okay, let me go through here. Okay, Chava has a couple questions here about research. She's asking Zeeva about your connection to the
Pattergit, the Pattergits, yeah.
Hattergits. Okay.
Yeah, which is basically in Canarsie, Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
My grandparents lived in Canarsie, and that's my connection to the Pattergits. And across the Pattergit Basin, there was a new development, which I talk about in the book, which was Georgetown. I called it Canarsie because I thought that it would be too confusing for people to kind of keep that in mind. But the whole area is basically Canarsie, Brooklyn, which was once the home of the Canarsie Native Americans. And the area has been completely built up in terms of housing and stuff like that. It was very new. It was back in the 70s. So that entire area is featured there. But yeah, that's my connection.
Okay, and there's a question for Ruth. What kind of characterizations of Anne do you see that are unfortunate, wrong, or even malevolent?
Hmm.
Yeah, great question. Well, I think Anne comes up a lot, in the context of Greta Thunberg and climate change. I guess Greta says that she's inspired by Anne Frank. I think what we see most often, I mean, there are a couple. One is there's this image of Anne in a keffiyeh that has circulated a lot in the last it circulated a lot in the last year and a half, obviously, but it was around much longer before that. I think it was initiated by an artist in Norway in 2017. I don't remember all the details about it. They're in my book. um, and so I think obviously this is an image that pushes a lot of people's buttons in the context of Israel, Zionism, anti-Zionism. um, and the other way in which Anne is, I think, most often invoked is in terms of the migrant crisis. And I talked a little bit about it in Syria, but of course also in the United States during the first Trump administration with his, war on illegal immigrants. And we see that ramping up even more now. So there's one famous production of, there's a production of The Diary of Anne Frank, the play that was done in LA a couple years ago called The Diary of Anne Frank Latinx. And it was a production done exclusively with actors of a Latino background, and with a lot of elements in the production that were designed either explicitly or implicitly to tie it to the crisis in illegal immigration. And I heard about this and I thought, this is ridiculous. This is cultural appropriation. And then I read some interviews with the director, who, perhaps not surprisingly, is Jewish. And he was inspired by a CNN program in which he had heard that he had heard reference to a Jewish woman who was playing sort of a Meep Thies like role. Meep was Otto's secretary, who was extremely important in assisting the Franks in hiding. He had heard about this woman who was helping immigrants by signing her name on leases that they could use as safe houses and other things like that. And he was struck by the parallels between this situation. I wound up actually going to LA and seeing this production, and I write about it in the book. It was interesting and complicated in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And the place I came to settle in the long run is, that Anne is an important symbol to many, many people for all kinds of different reasons. And that certainly the goal of my book is not to police people's usage of her, but simply to try to educate them about the context in which she lived and to, promote thinking about that. I think especially, in this current moment, many, many people are very anxious about what's going on in America with Trump's different, seizures of power in different kinds of ways that are really, really disconcerting, to say the least. And there are a lot of sometimes people make sloppy comparisons and say, this is just like Anne Frank, or this is just like Nazi Germany. We saw it in the first Trump administration when immigrants were being rounded up at the border and people talked about them being put into concentration camps. I don't think it's useful to make that kind of blanket identifying type comparison. But what I think is most useful is to look at the direct historical situation, to look specifically at what happened to Anne Frank and at what's happening now, and to understand where the parallels are, as well as what makes it different.
Okay, Erica has a question for Zeeva. Have the Hebrew rights been sold yet? And if so, is there anticipated Hebrew publication date? And how do you expect the reception in Israel may differ from the reception in the US to date?
Well, to my real dismay and absolute disappointment, my agent did try to sell the rights in Israel, and from what I understand, the agent there sent it around to a whole bunch of places who were not interested. As a matter of fact, they were told that anything that was coming from outside, they were basically they were interested in fantasy books right now, which I can understand. I get it. I get it. It's a really, really hard time, and my heart's broken a little bit, but in malasot. I mean, there's really nothing I can do. So no, not now, but I hope that my agent will try again and, God willing, if there'll be quiet. I don't even ask for peace. I just ask for quiet and all the hostages back home and, and no more. Just check it. That's it.
Yeah.
And I'm into that.
Oh, no, sorry. I wish.
But this is a question for all three of you. Have the rights been sold in any other languages for any of your books?
I got an offer, but touch wood, last week to Russian, which is
Wow.
very, very interesting because there's a Russian, like I said, immigrants in the book, so it's really interesting, and for me, it's like really, I will be so happy if it will happen. That's it, and we're doing a mini series in Israel. We are starting shooting the mini series
Oh,
in a month.
Wow.
that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Mazal tov.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see what happened with the book. Really, it's a journey that I couldn't even pray that it will be so amazing. Um, that's it. Someone asked here about, and I think the three of us are about the research. So, um, uh, my character is Dimension, and I really went into a lot of Facebook groups, and I was meeting families, and it was very, very important to me to be very accurate about it. So it won't be, and one doctor one day, he posted something and he said, if you want to know something about Dimension, either see the movie Ha'av, the father,
Mhm.
or read Lihi Lapid's book about them. So I
Oh,
said
Wow.
that's but I do think that it's three women here that are really researching, and I think even in a book like mine, I think when you need to write about something that is really in your heart, and you know something better than other people, or at least good enough to talk about it. So if I take my book, it's like really I grew up in Arad in the desert, and the character is from there. So and Ziva is also talking about her parents giving her. So I think, yeah,
That actually leads me to another question for both of our novelists here, which is Lihi, in your book, Nina is running from an abusive older man, and Ziva, in your book, we have the murder that takes place right at the beginning. And were either of those aspects or those characters um, from something that you had heard in real life, or was that like fiction, total fiction? I mean.
so Ruth, do you want to go?
Oh, that's not you, right?
Okay. Okay, so I'll go. That was total fiction, that whole thing. But there were, but in terms of the Jewish Arab love affair,
Mhm.
that there is a small little, well, not so small, but a story that my father told me about a cousin of his in
Mhm.
Syria who who worked for a publisher of a newspaper in Damascus and fell in love with his son, and they were Muslim Syrians, and she wound up marrying him. And my father's family basically sat shiva for her, but there was that love story there. So all of these threads kind of in the tapestry of the family history sort of makes their way in some form or another,
Mhm.
in some abstract, sometimes bastardized form, they kind of make their way into the novel. So, but the murder, thankfully, no.
Okay.
Not that. Yeah.
I as a writer in the newspaper, and because I write a lot about women and about empowering women, so many times I used to be in, I don't know, in all kind of places, and one place was a house for young women, young women that were trying to take out of prostitute. And I asked I went there, and there were such young, wonderful, smart young women. So I sat with the manager and I said, how does it happen? How did they? And she says, they're not going to be uh, prostitutes. It's just, she lives in a little town and she wants to go to a party in the big town. And one taxi driver says, I'll take you. And next time he says, you know what, if I take you, maybe, and slowly it comes to, it's not prostitution like totally working in, but it starts, she and then it deteriorates. And I wanted to talk about this whole dream today that young women have of being, because you are beautiful, you can be a model, you can conquer the world, just, and a lot of bad people are getting advantage of it and use you, and how it's a wild world out there. And so I wanted uh, to save Nina from that a moment before, but she runs away from home and she thinks she's smarter than her mother, and at the end she's not. So yeah,
You did
but
it so well. So I mean, it was like I didn't want to read it, right before I went to bed, um you did it so
no
well.
one.
I read the whole thing in one day, by the way.
Wow,
So,
thank you.
um,
Erica is saying like this, so I'm like, I are doing like.
um, okay, we have I think one more question. I'll let you all answer the question, Ellen's question about the Brandeis group in the chat, but I think Chava was asking also about um, releasing a book in a post October 7th world. I know Ruth, you had to rewrite some of your book, right? So why don't you go first, and if you could each kind of address that, how it's been to launch your book in the current climate.
Yeah, so I finished what I thought was the final draft of my book on October 6th, 2023.
Wow.
And I went to bed, and in the morning I woke up, and the whole Jewish world had changed. And my book actually was held up by the publisher for unrelated reasons. There were some legal issues that took some time to work out. And in the period of months when it was held up, so it actually had been supposed to come out originally some months ago, wound up coming out in January. In those months that it spent in this kind of legal limbo, it was time that I could have spent revising things, improving, whatever. I actually didn't touch the manuscript. I found myself unable to work on it. And it took me a few months to realize that the reason I felt that way was because my perspective on the Holocaust had changed after October 7th. That the person who had written that book was no longer exactly the person I was at the moment. And I think it's going to take us all a very, very long time to process our thoughts about October 7th in relation to the Holocaust and how we understand this as a continuation, or, where it fits into the very long history of anti-Semitism. But once I realized that this was what was holding me back, I found myself able to approach the book again. And what I realized had to be changed in it was that as especially in light of the world's reaction to October 7th, I realized that I could no longer count on my reader to understand what I was talking about when I used the word Zionism. Zionism comes up, not a lot, but occasionally in the book, as Anne's friends in Amsterdam are going to Zionist youth clubs, as Hello Silberberg does in the little excerpt that I read. It comes up in the context of Otto Frank making the decision after Kristallnacht, after Hitler's coming to power in Germany, about where to move his family. And it seems that they did consider Palestine at that point and decided on the Netherlands instead, whereas obviously we know many Western European Jews at that point made a different choice and had a very different family outcome. And there are other places where Zionism is mentioned with an understanding that the reader is going to see the word Zionism and think, oh, the desire for a Jewish homeland where Jews can live free from persecution. And it, had become abundantly clear that that wasn't necessarily the clause that my readers were going to automatically insert after the mention of Zionism. And so I went back and I searched the whole text for the word Zionist or Zionism. And where it seemed to be necessary, I inserted that little clarification to make it clear, that when teenagers in Amsterdam in the 1930s and 1940s were going to Zionist youth groups, what they were doing there and what they hoped to accomplish. And so, I added also there had been in that previous draft, there had been a small section about Anne Frank in the context of anti-Zionism. And obviously all of that needed to be changed in the wake of October 7th. And so I added some material there reflecting a little bit on the attack. People have often asked, was Anne a Zionist? The short answer is no. That when some of her friends were interested in these youth groups and attended the youth groups, she did not. She was not interested in politics generally. And then there's a larger question, well, what would she have done after the war? And her father, who did become a strong Zionist after the war, though he never lived in Israel, he visited frequently and was certainly, or he visited anyway, and he certainly identified as pro-Israel. Her father said, sometimes with great certainty that Anne would have been a Zionist after the war. And my answer to those questions is always that we don't know. We cannot impute political or other positions to Anne about events that took place after she died. We do know that many, many Holocaust survivors obviously did find a home in Israel, and even if they hadn't identified as Zionists before the war, that they did make that choice. And I tell some of their stories in the book in that context. But I emphasize that, people often are very eager to imagine Anne taking whatever political position they themselves take, whether that position is one of Zionism and support for Israel, or whether it's one of critiquing very harshly the Israeli government in different ways, as Anne has become a symbol of peace and tolerance, understood in the most general way. And one of the difficulties with that is that that means something different to absolutely everyone. And what I say in the book is simply that we cannot know. We cannot know anything about what Anne would have thought had she survived the war. Would she be a Holocaust? Would she have become a settler? Would she have become, would she be one of these Holocaust survivors who gave testimony to the Knesset about their grandchildren who were taken hostage on October 7th, which is a detail that I just found so unbelievably heartbreaking. Some of these survivors who have testified, in fact, are the same age that Anne would be now if she were still alive. Would she be one of these, peace-loving kibbutz dwellers who had been, working towards peace with Gaza, driving Gazans for treatment in Israel and all that? We simply don't know. All of those are possibilities based on the historical situation.
Yeah. That's a tough act to follow, Ruth. In terms of, I was actually on the last edits on October 7th, and I could not touch the book for months after that. But I had to get it into my publisher And I wound up getting it into the publisher sometime in January. I did not change anything. And at first, I really felt like, oh my God, how could I possibly write a book where there is a love story between a Palestinian and an Israeli? It just felt, after October 7th, it felt, I it's hard to describe. I I almost felt like I actually called the publisher, my editor, and said, "Are you sure you want to put this book out?" Because I really I felt bad. I wasn't sure how it would be received. I almost felt like I had done, you know, I basically asked myself, how could you write a book like this in light of all of this? And then I began thinking that maybe maybe it's what's needed. Maybe not right now, maybe down the line, but at some point that the idea of loving the other, of loving somebody who is not like you, loving somebody who's supposed to be your enemy, or all of, a kind of Romeo and Juliet um, trope going through the novel, which unfortunately Romeo and Juliet ends in a tragedy, the way the Hadass and Daoud story ends at the beginning of the book. But I I hope that people come away with the idea that honestly, that empathy, compassion for the other is honestly the only way that we can move forward. That acknowledging that we've caused each other pain, that people have died on both sides, that war is devastating, all of those things. I'm hoping that at some point we'll be able to look at it, and conceive of it, because right now it feels inconceivable. And I guess that's the word, that I was looking for before, that it felt inconceivable at that time. And then I'm hoping that people come away feeling hopeful after reading the book, that it is the thing that we need, we need some hope and love, right?
Definitely. I will tell a different story. My book I can say that when we translated the book, so at the end, we took two paragraphs that were in Hebrew at the end of the book, and we switched places between the both of them. Because it sounded better in English. That I don't know what I don't want to ruin the end. But it didn't change, and it wasn't because 7th of October. Like I said before, it made it stronger for me that the book is being published after 7th of October and showing a family in Israel. I want to say two things. First of all, about what Ruth said about Zionism. My father-in-law, Lihi Lapid, was a Holocaust survivor, and he said that when they took them out from the ghetto of Budapest to the death march, and suddenly there was noise and something, and his mother, he was 13, put him in a public toilet, and they hide there. And when they went out of the toilet, the death march ended. All the bodies were on the Danuba, and Tommy and his mother didn't have anywhere to go to, so they went back to the ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that that's the moment he became Zionist, because he wanted a place that Jews can go to. So I think, Ruth, that Otto didn't come and to live in Israel. Her father is Otto, right? And I think there are Zionists that are really left wing, and there are Zionists that are really right wing. I'm so sad that Zionism became a name for aggression and not of this 13-year-old boy looking for a place to live and not be hunted. So that's I will tell a sweet, bitter story. We had an American partner to our series that we do on TV. And after 7th of October, we felt that we can't not put the October of the 7th of October in the book. So the daughter of Itamar that lives in America, she studies in high school, and she see her friends tearing down the posters of the kidnapped people.
Mm-hmm.
She has a huge fight with her friends. And our American partner said, either take it out of the series. We bought the book like it is without 7th of October. Either take it out or we are out of the project.
Wow.
Our producers in Israel and the Yes Company said, we are not taking it out and we are paying for your part also. So I want to say that it will, and this is a secret, so keep it in between us. The young high school girl that will play, the actress that will play the high school girl, will be Eden Golan, the one that was in the Eurovision song, that really had a lot of anti-Semitism events. So we felt that she's really great for the part to be a young American that her friends are tearing hostage posters. So yeah, we didn't give up, and it will be in the series.
Amazing. Well, there's like so many more questions I could keep talking about and asking, but I think we're out of time. One thing I'm just going to put in everybody's mind, back in everyone's mind, is something you said, Lihi, at the start of the question session about keeping family together. And I don't think you were just talking about the nuclear families, but the larger family of Jews all around the world. And it's something I've been thinking about, particularly since the Jewish Book Council session that I participated in back in November. And it seemed like there were some gaps between the people in the audience and the people on the panel I was with. So it's something I've been thinking about. How can we keep our family together, keep through literature or other ways. So let's just leave all of you with that open question, something to think about. And also to tell you, we have save the dates, or you can already register. In March, we have an in-person and on Zoom event, March 23rd, with Ayelet Sabari, Joan Legant, who is here with us tonight, and Avi Landis. He has a wedding, so he couldn't be here tonight, but he's almost always here at other events. So that's March 23rd. If you're in driving distance of Modiin, please join us in person. And if you're not, then please join us on Zoom. And then on April 27th, we have a kind of post Yom HaShoah literary Modiin event with Brooke Randell, who's also here tonight. I don't know if she's still on, and Julie Brill and Lisa Barr. So 3 kind of Holocaust related books. One is a novel and 2 are memoirs. So you can sign up for them here. And now I'm going to just share my screen, and we are going to say the tefillah for the hostages. 1 second. And Lihi, you'll just have to excuse my bad accent when I read this. Okay, and you can all read along with me. And halavai, that by our next event, or even by tomorrow, or by, like, we won't need to be saying this prayer anymore. And this is not the usual one that we read in my shul, but something that Rav Goren wrote, and I've adopted it a little bit, as you will hear. Misha Berach Avoteno ve'imoteno Avraham v'Sara Yitzchak v'Rivka Yaakov Leah v'Rachel ואת לוחמנו יהושע דוד ויהודה דבורה יעל ויהודית הוא יברך את שבויי ונעדרי צה"ל והאזרחים והאזרחיות החטופים והחטופות הנתונים והנתונות בשביה וצרה. יהי רצון מפניך, אדוני צבאות, שתפדה נפשם משבי, ותחזירם במהרה לארצם למשפחתם ולביתם, בריאים ושלמים בגופם ובנפשם, ותיתן תבונה בלב העמלים לשחרורם, ותיתן רחמים בלב שוביהם, ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כל ברמה נשמע נהי בכי תמרורים, רחל מבכה על בניה מענה להנחם על בניה כי איננו. כה אמר אדוני מנעי קולך מבכי ועינייך מדמעה כי יש שכר לפעולתך, נאום אדוני ושבו מארץ אויב, ויש תקווה לאחריתך, נאום אדוני ושבו בנים ובנות לגבולם. And that's from Sefer
Amen.
Amen, amen. And that's it. May we hear good news soon. And thank you all for being with us. Thank you very much to Lihi, Zeeva, and Ruth. And
it was a big honor to be with the both of you. Thank you. And thank you.
It was a huge honor for me too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Julie, for putting
bye,
us all together.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Julie. Bye.